of the social movements of the 1960s, especially beyond the moment when the draft threatened to take away so many college students and therefore precipitated a vast opposition to the war. That's about all that I want to add. So by all means, now let's take some questions and comments. Yes?
Yeah, I might be betraying historical ignorance here, but when Tom says that the assassinations kind of decapitated the movement and put the kibosh on it, I want to ask about LBJ. Like everyone else, I was really relieved, wept with gratitude when he said he wouldn't run again, and I hated the Vietnam War. But what about LBJ's War on Poverty and the 1964 Voting Rights Act?
65.
No.
65. Well,
Okay.
did you want this moved? Well, Johnson's great contribution, besides the Voting Rights Act, was Medicare. But that was totally overshadowed by his adventure in Vietnam, and we had hoped that you could combine civil rights and anti-poverty, but the budget for war eclipsed all that, which has now happened with Afghanistan and Iraq and the Long War. So I don't want to get into it in detail. I just think that Johnson lost the possibility, and I don't know why. There's a new thinking that says he was so afraid of Goldwater that that's the real reason, since he was all politics, that's the real reason he went into Vietnam. And he had no idea, because he was an American leader full of this American exceptionalism stuff, that the war would take 12 years and cost 58,000 American lives and hundreds of thousands of wounded and 2 million people in Indochina. He had no idea. He boasted that he could afford both guns and butter. I guess he could, but beyond butter, he couldn't afford much else, like affordable housing or investment in urban infrastructure. So the project went down. If he had stayed out of Vietnam, it could have been another matter. But the same thing has now happened. The Cold War has been replaced by the Long War, which is a Pentagon doctrine that calls for an 80-year, 50 to 80 year, 20 presidential terms, an 80-year war against Islamic fundamentalism, in which conflicts like Afghanistan are seen as theaters of war within the context of a much longer war. That's why, if Afghanistan winds down, which we're trying to make happen, unless there's a deeper struggle, it'll be replaced by succeeding wars. I think we have succeeded in making it impossible for any American president to send ground troops into combat again. You see what happened with Libya. But it doesn't end alliances with mercenary armies or drone attacks or other forms of warfare. So in that sense, it's repeating itself. But is that an adequate answer to your point about Johnson?
Well, yeah, but I wonder, this document, Pentagon document about the 80-year war, how do you know about that document? Do you have a copy of it?
Yeah, I can get it for you. It's in the Pentagon's Quadrennial Defense Review 2004, but it's also the top advisor, the top advisor to General Petraeus, whose name is David Kilcullen, Kilcullan, is an Australian counterinsurgency specialist who fought in some Pacific wars. He's the author, and Kilcullen gave the idea to Petraeus, who embraced it. There's also something that you can go online and read, which is called the Long War Journal. I think longwarjournal.com. There's also, for a more progressive view of it, there's a book called The Long War. It's edited by Andrew Bacevich, Bacevich, who is a professor in Boston and was in the service for a very long time and served in Vietnam and lost his son in Iraq. The Long War, it's got 15 or 20 essays. So that's the concept. I think actually that Obama's against it. But the forces that are pushing it are too difficult for him to take on. But Petraeus has very much said the Afghanistan war, and by that he means the whole war against terrorism, will go on through the lifetimes of our children. That's a direct quote from Petraeus. He said that he doesn't see any end to the Afghanistan war. He's now the head of Central Intelligence. So there's sufficient documentation, but what's striking to me is that during the 60s, we knew there was a Cold War. It was proudly declared, right? And that Vietnam was part of the Cold War. Today, we're not aware that there is a long war, that Afghanistan is merely a phase in. And I think that's a credit to us, because those who are pushing the long war don't even want to say it, because people would flip out. If I campaign for president, I'm going to claim not only your children, your grandchildren, their grandchildren, 80 years from now, when somebody else is president who's not even born yet. We'll still be fighting the long war. That wouldn't go over very well as a campaign platform. So I think we have to dig it up and talk about it, that this is what's in store. This is what's in store. It's a forever war.
Yes.
Just a little bit of a follow-up. I agree with what you said about Johnson, but what assurance do we have that Kennedy would have handled Vietnam any differently?
We don't. I personally think he would have.
I do too.
But there's a big fight among historians. It's unbelievable. It's like fights on the left. But I think that he would not have expanded the war the way it turned out. Other people, like Chomsky, think there's no difference between Kennedy and Johnson at all. We're arguing over the dead, though. We don't know.
Yes. Could it be that instead of Johnson having proven himself a bigger man than Goldwater, that he had a lot of pressure on him from the corporations that made money off of Vietnam, like KRB, Kellogg Brown and Root, and the same thing is happening today, is that those people that, the corporations that are making the enormous funds off of Afghanistan and Iraq, et cetera, are the ones that are empowering the politicians to continue this war, and that we have to circumvent that.
Well, yeah, I mean, Halliburton's history is in the corporation that you identify, and that's a Texas corporation that had a lot to do with putting Johnson in power. Personally, I don't think Johnson escalated the war in order to satisfy the contractors. But once you start to escalate, then you set in motion a lobbying apparatus with contractors and subcontractors that have enormous influence on Johnson and on the Congress. And they make it hard to get out. I mean, Washington is completely surrounded by offices of military contractors, and they're in every day in those offices with smart, sophisticated, well-paid advocates for this weapon or that weapon, but they don't advocate for the long war. I'm not even sure they know what the long war is. The advocates for the long war are defense intellectuals around the think tanks in Washington.
But that's what Eisenhower warned us against.
Yes.
In his last speech was
Yeah.
the military-industrial complex.
Well, we have a military-industrial complex, yeah, but doesn't mean that they agreed that we should start a war in Afghanistan. That lunatic mission has to be traced to specific people, not to a whole complex. The complex wants to make money off of space, off of weapons, off of spy satellites, anything will do. But somebody, I think for political reasons, maybe because I'd stress the political factor, somebody felt that we couldn't afford not to go into Afghanistan. And that's the winning argument in government, that if your reputation and resources are at stake, you'll be considered soft on this or soft on that if you don't go in. You combine that with the idea that we can wipe these people out in a very short period. It won't be a very expensive venture. You kind of capture the decision-making machinery. Congress is weak and out of the picture. The public doesn't get any information. Today, aside from the Seattle newspaper, I don't think there's a newspaper in the United States that's advocated withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think we're doing pretty well, given the fact that there's nobody in the media that has ever taken the position of the anti-war movement. So it's complicated, but I think if you start with the Chinese Revolution and you go to now, you'll see the whole thing just keeps repeating over and over and over. Who lost China? I don't know. Anybody here found it? Who lost Vietnam? It's this fear.
Andrew Basevich has sort of drawn upon the great Wisconsin professor William Appleman Williams in saying that no one is elected president in his own mind, for that matter, with a desire or a commitment to reduce the American empire. That the vision of empire goes back at least to the middle of the 19th century, when the U.S. began to take over Latin America, and has been a consistent belief, and more than that, Williams would say, and Basevich says, has most frequently been a consensual belief.
It started with Jefferson.
Indeed, with Jefferson, so that Americans of all races, creeds, and colors have felt that the empire was an awfully good thing for themselves, and perhaps that added a religious spice to their self-understanding or misunderstanding, and remains, for those who are active and important today, a consensual belief. Getting away from the presumption of empire is something that